All right, everyone. So this is your first lecture for American History or History 131. And we're going to spend the next couple of weeks really talking about the Americas as well as Africa prior to the beginning of contact with the European world, and then also talk about how contact emerged and what happened as a result. And I'm sure that a lot of you at this point have taken several American history classes in K through 12 and also have learned a great deal about Europe. But I've noticed that one of the ways that a lot of teachers prefer to teach American history is to just begin teaching in the colonial era and to kind of jump right in with this Anglo-American history. And what you really don't get from this is a full understanding of the dynamic between the three large groups of people living in the Americas early on. And so in order to really understand the kind of diverse experiences people had in the New World, you have to travel back in history and understand pre-contact America as well as Africa prior to the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And so what you're going to see in later lectures is that each of these three groups, the Europeans, the African Americans, and the Native Americans, experienced life very differently throughout American history, and this was based upon their social position, which was of course determined by their race, their gender, and their class. But for now, we're going to focus specifically on understanding the roots of the culture and the belief systems of African and Native American people, and then we'll work our way into understanding Europeans upon their arrival and the growth of Anglo-American culture. Alright, so we're going to start out talking about Native Americans before contact. But before we can really begin discussing what their culture was like, I just want to point out that there are a lot of incorrect and unfair stereotypes that are applied to Native Americans even today, and most of these stereotypes have derived themselves from the colonial and the Victorian era, and they have continued on into the present day in the form of our media. And you can probably see these stereotypes in movies like Twilight or Dances with Wolves or The Lone Ranger. And we're going to talk much more in depth in class about some of these, but I think it's important to remember that there are usually historical origins to many of the unfair beliefs that people have about certain groups of people. And while there are many different stereotypes of natives that are very evident in our popular culture, there are two main stereotypes that fall on opposite ends of the spectrum when you look at them. The first is something that historians call the primitive or the backward savage stereotype, and this is the idea that Europeans, when they arrived in the New World, were incredibly civilized people who encountered Native Americans who were savage, and that they saved them from their constant warfare, from their lack of education, and from their lack of faith in the Christian God. And according to this theory, Native American people came from this barren land that was uncultured. They had this very primitive way of living, and that this was transformed by Europeans to a much more productive, politically organized, and civilized country. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum of stereotypes is the idea of the innocent or noble savage, and if you've ever had to read or seen the film The Last of the Mohicans, you see this playing out. It's a stereotype that really holds that Native Americans who were always innocent and always good to the earth and never ever wasted any kind of animal products were unfairly enslaved, and their once pristine and beautiful country was debauched and ruined by evil Europeans on a mass scale. And as it turns out, neither of these are a wholly accurate portrayal of what Native people were like or of what contact between the two groups was like. And as you'll see throughout this course, history is very rarely going to be seen in shades, of black and white, but instead there will be some fleshing out that we need to do of these topics. A lot of what we know about contact between Europe and these indigenous people in the 1400s has to do with the exploration of Christopher Columbus. And in fact, a lot of what people think they know about Christopher Columbus isn't true. For example, Christopher Columbus never discovered America. He set sail hoping to find India. He was looking for a trade route to India so that he could avoid the Muslim-dominated trade routes after the Crusades, and he was funded by the King and Queen of Spain, although he was not a Spanish citizen. He was from Genoa. And what he ended up finding is that he ended up landing in Hispaniola, and because he believed that he had found India, even though he was several thousand miles off the mark, he named the people Indios, and that name sort of stuck. And you'll see that throughout the course, as well as this lecture, I will use the term Native Americans or First People, First Nation, or if I know a tribal group, I'll use a tribal affiliation, but I don't call these people Indians because they don't identify as such. In addition, Columbus didn't really discover America, so to speak. America had been here for quite some time, or the land of North America and South America, and the indigenous people had been living here, some historians would say, for almost 35,000 years before he ever arrived. And well before the arrival of him or future conquistadors, there were the Vikings with Leif Erikson coming into Newfoundland. There was also a visit from the people of Holland. There are theories that there was contact between the Chinese and the Ming Dynasty and parts of the Americas, as well as between the Polynesian Islands and parts of Ecuador. So I think it's not necessarily fair to say that he discovered America. There were already 70 million people living in the Americas when Columbus first arrived here, and oftentimes we picture the Americas as having been, this incredibly empty place where it was mostly wild nature, but in fact, there were almost as many people in the Americas as there were in Europe. Now, there wasn't just one monolithic culture, and that's why it's unfair to have all of these stereotypes about what it means to be a native person. When you look at the map on the screen, you see a couple of the larger cultural groups: Florida, the Eastern Woodlands, the Great Plains, Texas, the southwestern area, the Great Basin, California, the Northwest, and the Northwest Plateau. But within each of those areas are many different tribal groups, each one with its own culture and with its own traditions. And there were hundreds and hundreds of tribes when Columbus arrived, and there are still hundreds of tribes, although not all of them are federally recognized. Now, the very first significant Native American cultural group that anthropologists have discovered are the Clovis people, who lived in New Mexico, and they were distinguished by a Clovis point, a projectile point that we found in all of their various settlements. And it tells us that there were indigenous people living in the Americas quite a long time ago. Historians, anthropologists, and even scientists have all been attempting to understand how it is that the Americas were first settled by indigenous people. Now, most of the scientific community accepts that humankind emerged from the cradle of civilization in Africa, and that slowly, over a period of thousands of years, that people began to migrate across the globe to all of the different corners. And the way that historians and anthropologists will refer to these first native people who move into the American continent is to call them Paleo-Indians, and this was during the final glacial episodes of the late Pleistocene period. There's a lot of different theories about how the indigenous people first came into the Americas. If you were to ask most Native Americans, they would probably tell you that their tribal group has always been living in the Americas, that they were put here by their creator, and that the land in which they live is their holy land. But a lot of scientists and anthropologists would argue for something called the Bering Strait theory. And this theory is based on the idea that these large animal hunters crossed over the Bering Strait, which was an ice bridge called Beringia, and it connected Eurasia to North America between 45,000 BCE and 12,000 BCE, and this essentially allowed people from Eurasia to simply walk across the water and move their way from the northwestern part of the Americas down all the way into South America. And in fact, today there are scientific studies that are attempting to link the DNA of people living in Mongolia and also in China with Native Americans living in the Americas. But most recently, there's been quite a bit of buzz around the fact that historians and linguists are starting to refute this Bering Strait theory. There's a lot of new theories that you guys are going to learn about in this class about how it is that indigenous people, first came to inhabit the Americas. And there's a lot of politics behind this. Some people think that if we can deny Native Americans a history in which they have migrated to the Americas thousands of years ago, then it will be easier to deny them the terms of the treaties that we violated, because we could claim that they had essentially moved into the country and taken over that territory much like Europeans had. So on the one hand, this isn't necessarily something that's impartial scholarship by historians and by scientists, because there is this sort of politicized element to it. And then on the other hand, there certainly is a true desire by scholars to really understand the origins of the people of the Americas. While we don't necessarily know exactly how the first inhabitants of the Americas arrived, we do know a good deal about the culture of these people after their arrival. We know that there were two different subsistence methods for ancient Native Americans. Early on, they were hunter-gatherers, and eventually they became farmers who relied upon hunting and gathering on the side. So when they were hunters and gatherers, they were Paleo Indians. They lived in very small bands that were nomadic, meaning they moved around, often seasonally, following the herds of animals or following water routes. They were egalitarian, and egalitarian simply comes from the Latin root egal, which means equal, which means that in many of these Paleo Indian bands, men and women and various groups of people were all considered equal. There was no social hierarchy. They often hunted large animals like mammoths and mastodons in order to survive prior to these large animals going extinct, along with other large megafauna. Now, what we do notice is that there's a gender-based division of labor amongst these Paleo Indians, which means simply that men had one task while women had another, and this was also really common in European society, as you'll eventually come to learn about. So prior to the advent of farming and agriculture, Native American women had a lot of status and power, because while the men were responsible for hunting, women were supposed to maintain the base camp, tend the children, forage for roots and berries, turn animal skin into clothing, and turn animal carcasses into meat. They also determined when it was time for a band to move on to new resources because they had exhausted their supplies. So women often provided about 70% of what the tribe ate, while men provided just 30%. And you'll see that this status of women is seen in the political systems as well as the religious beliefs of many Paleo Indians. This picture is of a place called the Ava site, which is a prehistoric site located in Tennessee, which you can actually visit. And it has actually allowed scholars to study the bones of Native men, women, and children. And what they found from this is that despite the fact that women had a great deal of power and leadership roles in Native society, their lives weren't necessarily better than those of men. Women lived significantly shorter lifespans than the men of the community. And this might surprise you because while women stayed at the base camp, men often went out hunting, and it was incredibly dangerous and difficult work to go out and hunt a mammoth or a mastodon. And yet women on a daily basis did something that was far more dangerous than what men would do. And this is that women had to face the danger of childbirth. And all the way up into the 20th century, childbirth has been one of the most dangerous things that women undergo in their lives. Native people switched from the first method of subsistence to the second one around 5000 BCE with the advent of farming in Mesoamerica amongst the Olmec people who lived in the basin of Mexico. They first began farming pumpkin, squash, potatoes, avocados, and something called teosinte. Teosinte is the predecessor to corn, and whereas corn cobs today are these giant cobs with big yellow pieces of corn that will fill a person up, the actual cobs of Teosinte were about the size of a quarter. And some historians have actually called this the greatest feat of genetic engineering of mankind, because slowly over time, Native Americans were able to essentially engineer from this tiny little cob a much larger cob of corn. Within these agricultural societies, women were the ones who were responsible for farming and for food processing, and men were still responsible for hunting small game, and occasionally when the harvest came and women needed help, then the men would also come and help with this. Now, whenever you see the rise of agriculture, you see several trends that go along with it. In world history, when humans first settled down and agriculture arose, you saw a stabilization of the population, you saw an increase in population, and you also saw the growth of the first cities and civilizations. Something very similar happened in the Americas. The availability of crops meant that you could feed more people, so the population increased. You started to see much more complex societies because you could have job specialization, and not all men had to hunt and all women had to farm or process food, but that they could take on new roles. And as these settlements began to grow, you would start to see larger cities amongst the native population, as well as increasing trade networks and lots of different goods that they were trading. So in essence, their societies became more sophisticated once they settled down and practiced agriculture. Women had a much heavier workload than they did before, and they continued to face these new dangers in the sedentary lifestyle, because while men were often away hunting for the small game, women stayed in the village, and disease was often there, especially when they were located right around the area where the animals were being kept. It wasn't uncommon for disease to be lurking and for women and children to be the ones who caught it first. Still, during this time period, it would be unfair to say that there was just one monolithic culture. There were many different types of agricultural societies that emerged. There are three main groups. You had those in Mesoamerica, the civilizations of the Andes, and then those in North America. And most of you are probably familiar, at least generally, with the people of Mesoamerica because you've probably studied the Mayans before, and of all of the different native groups we'll look at, they were probably the most technologically advanced. Another group within Mesoamerica lived in the city of Teotihuacan, which is in present-day Mexico City, and it was an incredibly large city with large pyramids and a 2.5-kilometer road, and certainly it represented the technological advancement of native people after the birth of agriculture. The civilizations of the Andes, including Chavín de Huántar and the Moche, are also really interesting places. They tended to be areas in which people went on religious pilgrimages, and oftentimes their cultures were sort of centered around the idea of taking hallucinogenic drugs like the San Pedro cactus and communicating with the spirit world. And then the last group, which you're also probably familiar with, are the North American native people. You've got the Pueblo people, such as the Navajo. You've got Mississippian chiefdoms, as well as the Eastern Woodland groups. And if you live in North Carolina, you're probably most familiar with the Cherokee, and they're an example of one of the Eastern Woodland groups, as are the other 5 civilized tribes in American history you might have learned about. I think one of the greatest myths about society back then is that European society was just much more technologically advanced than that of native people, but this is absolutely untrue after the rise of agriculture in the Americas. If you look at groups like the Maya, they had an incredibly advanced writing system, and they also had advanced calendars. You can see here this large stone slab represents the Mayan number system, and the calendar over on the right is actually quite famous because many of us know that people believed that the world was going to end in 2012 because that's when the Mayan calendar ended. The Mayans also had something called the Dresden Codex, which is just one of their many codices on astronomy. They knew a great deal about science and also about mathematics. They knew, for example, when a solar eclipse was going to happen and what it was. They didn't blame it upon the gods, for example, but understood the sort of general ideas behind astronomy. And then there were also large cities that the Mayans lived in, such as Teotihuacan and Tikal, which would have given places like London a run for its money. And while most people are probably more familiar with European artwork from world history, there is a lot of really important art and writing from the Americas as well. You see, for example, in the upper left-hand screen here, an image from one of the codices from the Mayans, and you can see the little symbols around the edge of it. These are Mayan glyphs, which look a little bit like the Egyptian hieroglyphics. They tell us exactly what's happening in this very strange primary source here. And then beneath that, you see what are a series of knotted cords, and this is called quipu. It comes from the Inca tribe, and essentially, in order to have their language record their history, they began recording usually bureaucratic issues such as accounting with little knots on strings, and then they would be able to read and understand exactly what these strings were telling them. It's a form of a proto-writing system in a place that didn't necessarily have a written alphabet. And then you see further over in the center, as well as on the right, you see some murals from the Americas, especially from South America. And the color Maya Azul is very unique to the Americas and to their artwork. And it's this sort of turquoise green-blue color that are located in these pictures. And then finally, down on the far right-hand side, you see a inscription of the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, and you'll often see these sculptures that look similar in many of the different American societies. The images on this slide also represent some of the artwork that's been found by anthropologists and archaeologists. And these originated in various parts of the Americas and were often traded along vast trading networks. You see, for example, a necklace or a breastplate on the bottom right, as well as earrings on the top right, and a pipe on the bottom left. So this probably looks extremely strange to you, but if you remember when I was talking about the three main different groups of native people, I mentioned the civilizations of the Andes and the Moche people. The Moche are probably most famous for the pottery that has been discovered that they created, and they're affectionately dubbed porn pots, which you can probably see why. And in most of these various sculptures, they're actually involved in some kind of sexual intercourse or act, and it actually tells us a great deal about their culture. Interestingly enough, anthropologists have learned that the Moche people, like many people before the 18th or 19th century, didn't really understand anything about conception or how a woman conceived a child, and that they believed, in fact, that oral intercourse was the way in which a woman could become pregnant. And so for them, creating these forms of pottery was a means of capturing something that they saw as incredibly holy and central to their life cycle and life force. So these wouldn't have seemed abnormal to them. And for our purposes, you can see the incredibly intricate detail of their artwork, which shows just how advanced this society was, despite not necessarily understanding exactly how a child was made. But lest you think that European society understood this any better, for a very long time, even in early America, there was a belief that in order for a woman to conceive a child, both a man and a woman had to climax together, and that this is how a child was conceived. And it wasn't until the 18th century that scientists first discovered that there was an egg and a sperm, and that these two played a role in conception. So certainly the fact that the Moche misunderstood doesn't necessarily indicate that they weren't an advanced society. While the architecture of the people of the Americas looks much different than that of Europeans, it's no less monumental. If you look, you'll see that the top right side, you see a Mesoamerican stepped pyramid. If you've taken world history, you might remember that this does resemble a little bit the Mesopotamian ziggurats that existed in first wave civilizations. And in fact, one of the ways that historians have figured out that there was contact between all of the first civilizations is by the fact that in every single location where civilization emerged, including places like Africa, Mesoamerica, China, the Indus River Valley, Mesopotamia, we actually find pyramids in all of these places used for the same religious purposes. They all looked slightly different, but it gave us some insight into the fact that all of these groups were having contact with one another. Now, you also see the ruins of large temples and palaces, which tell us that in places where there was a chiefdom and there were rulers, that they lived in these beautiful examples of what would be similar to a castle in Europe, and also that they had magnificent religious structures. On the bottom left-hand side, as well as the middle, you see pictures from the city of Teotihuacan. You see the Avenue of the Dead, which is that 2.5-kilometer road that I was talking about earlier, as well as the two large stepped pyramids that are located in the city of Teotihuacan. And then all along that long Avenue of the Dead are also these large residential complexes where hundreds of residents were able to live. There is often an unfair portrayal of Native Americans prior to contact as being incredibly violent people. If you've ever seen movies like Mel Gibson's Apocalypto, they show these Native people slaughtering thousands of innocent men, women, and children, and Apocalypto is especially bad when it comes to portraying violence within Indigenous society. But we know that Native societies were not inherently violent, and they certainly weren't any more violent than the people of Europe or Asia. They did practice human sacrifice, but this was usually in a small amount. In the film Apocalypto, you'll see hundreds of people being lined up, and you'll see their heart being ripped out while it's still beating, and their body being tossed down one of the stepped pyramids. And yet this is certainly not how human sacrifice was practiced in these areas. Natives did experience warfare, of course, just like the people in Europe did, but they didn't have the same kind of weapons that Europeans did. They had cane swords when Europeans had steel swords. They didn't have guns, for example. They had bows and arrows. And so the death toll in European wars was actually a lot greater than in Native wars. And we know also that very often Native American men were portrayed by the conquistadors and the colonizers as being sexual aggressors and rapists, and yet prior to the arrival of Europeans, there's really no evidence at all that Native Americans ever had issues with sexual violence. And this is particularly true because typically, even in European history, the women who would be sexually assaulted would be captives of warfare, coming from the families of the losers. And yet, in Native American society, this wouldn't happen because quite often, those who were captured in warfare, if they didn't become slaves, they actually became family members or a sister, for example, of a warrior, or even a wife, and it certainly wouldn't do to sexually assault your new sister. In terms of the political and social structures, each one of the different tribal groups that you could learn from Native American history had their own political system and their own social structures, but we can sort of talk about various groups in a context of how many of them often had the same features. And so we'll talk, for example, about very hierarchical or stratified societies and those that are much more egalitarian, although various groups within those societies certainly would have practiced this differently. Now, almost all of these Native American groups were politically complex, and they moved away from this band structure that existed in antiquity and began to form these complex political systems in states after the advent of agriculture. So in the hierarchical or the highly stratified societies, power would be given to the elite class of royalty and to the nobles. And women would often have significant power if they were born into those particular classes, but poorer women certainly wouldn't. In a less stratified or mobile society, decision-making often occurred on a community level, which means that it was very egalitarian. In most tribes, although the chief was always a man, he was chosen by matrons, and these women could actually choose to remove the chief if he wasn't doing what was in the best interest of the community. And in addition, we see that both men and women were able to take on the role of a shaman in many of these societies. And a shaman was a spiritual leader who often had the power to heal, and in some places the shaman could also be the chief of a village. Despite the fact that there are a couple of different forms of political structure, there are just two basic social systems that tribal groups fell under. They were either a matriarchy or a patriarchy. And a matriarchy is just a society in which women, especially mothers, have central roles of political leadership, moral authority, and control of property. Within a matriarchy, very often, if you go and get married, then you'll go and live with the wife's parents, and it's called matrilocal when a couple lives with the wife's parents. They're located in proximity to the matra or the woman's side. In addition, if you look at the way that property and descent is traced in these societies, it's said to be matrilineal, and that means that if you had a house, it would be owned by the wife, and then it would be passed down to her daughters later on. And the Iroquois, who are a part of the Five Nations tribal group, are a good example of a matriarchal society. And in bands like those of the Iroquois tribe, you would find that women had a great deal of power and prestige, and they had a lot of freedom in their lives. So in a matriarchal society, if, say, a woman wanted to divorce her husband for any reason, she would simply take all of his belongings and pack them up in baskets and set them outside of the house on the front stoop, essentially kicking him out, stick him on the front porch, and he would have to come pick up all of his stuff and leave. She owned the home, or her parents owned it, and she would also maintain control of the children. She would keep custody of them, as well as any of the wealth that the couple had accumulated. And so the husband would be the one who would have to leave and essentially start over, which sounds very much the opposite of what existed for most of American history amongst Anglo-Americans. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum of social systems is the patriarchal systems, in which men were the primary authority figures central to social organization. They occupied roles of political leadership, moral authority, and control of property. And this is the system we're most familiar with because this is what existed in European and American society well into the 20th century, and some would still argue that we live under a patriarchy today, and they would point out evidence of the fact that most politicians are men, and most people in high-ranking and high-paid jobs, for example, are men. Now, the way that this played out within Native society, and the Aztec are a very good example of a patriarchy, is that you would have a patrilineal society, which means that if there was a home, that the husband would own this property and he would pass it down to usually his eldest son, so that the system of descent and inheritance is traced through the males. And it would also be a patrilocal society. So if a couple went and got married, they would either live in the husband's domicile, or they would live with the husband's parents. So in essence, it's the exact opposite, and the terms mean the exact opposite of matriarchy, matrilineal, and matrilocal. Native people practiced a huge variety of religious traditions. Most of them were polytheistic, which means that they worshipped lots of different gods, and many of them also worshipped their ancestors. They believed that they could use shamans to communicate with the spirit world, and that the way that shamans could do this would be by ingesting or drinking some kind of hallucinogenic mixture, and this might be made out of peyote or San Pedro cactus or coca, and that they could then commune with the spirit world. Most of the religions also practiced human sacrifice, although of a limited nature. And all native religions were based around the celestial and the terrestrial events. And so that would be things like the changing of the seasons, or the coming of the first snow, or the changing, for example, a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, or the changing of star patterns. And what we also see in almost all of these indigenous religions is a figure known as the Corn Mother or the Corn Goddess. And so when Europeans first arrived in the Americas and they brought missionaries who began to proselytize to the indigenous people, the natives actually were able to understand Christianity, and especially the concept of the Virgin Mary, through the context of their belief in a corn mother or corn goddess. And in fact, many native women joined Catholic convents because of this understanding. The way in which labor is performed is actually going to be something that we talk about often in this class, because we'll have to understand the role of indentured servants and the role of slaves and how they differ from one another. And so if you look at native people, most tribes would have performed their own labor. Slavery really would have been limited to taking hostages during times of war. And well, maybe except for the Aztec people, and the Aztec people would often go out and conquer the nearby people and require them to pay tribute. But for the most part, you would simply take hostages during war, and then you would adopt them into your families. There really wasn't a concept of perpetual servitude or a child being born as a slave, and certainly slavery was not based on skin color. When we do look at the first contact between natives and Europeans, one of the biggest differences that Europeans believed they had in comparison was in their structure of marriage and family, as well as their beliefs on sexuality. And yet you'll see that in many ways there were very similar beliefs about these topics. So within the indigenous societies, marriages were very personal relationships, but they could also easily be dissolved. So as I said, in a matrilineal society, if a woman wanted a divorce, she simply moved her husband's things out. And the opposite would be true in a patrilineal society. Now, in a matrilineal society, it was actually the maternal uncles who often disciplined and dealt with the children, and in the patrilineal society, it would have been the uncles on the father's side. And so a divorce wouldn't necessarily have been catastrophic for the children. They still would have had some kind of structure and discipline in their lives. Among many of the native groups of the East, newlyweds would limit their sexual contact during the first year of their marriage until the relationship was established, and they were actually most likely to divorce in this first year if things didn't work out. So while Europeans often portray them as being very sexually licentious, the truth is, you might ask yourself how many people could wait an entire year after being married before actually having any kind of sexual relationship. One of the major issues that Europeans really honed in on as explaining the difference between natives and themselves is the fact that natives practiced polygamy. And it certainly wasn't something that was terribly common in native society, because not very many men were able to afford or even desired to support multiple women. I mean, it's difficult enough to keep one wife happy, but imagine keeping 4 or 5 wives happy. And so, generally speaking, the ones who practiced polygamy were the wealthiest noblemen or warriors, and then the chiefs. And there was a form of polygamy that was practiced that would have been viewed as particularly unacceptable by Europeans. It was called soror polygamy. And this is when a man would go and marry 2 sisters. And especially in matrilineal societies, it would mean that he was still a part of the same lineage. And it simply made the marriage easier. Sex wasn't just in these native societies something that was done for procreation, but there was also a social function to this. And so when the Europeans first arrived in the New World, oftentimes the chiefs would offer a gift in the form of sending the most beautiful women, sometimes even their own daughters, to go and engage in intercourse in order to welcome these colonizers to the Americas. And these unmarried women would usually expect some kind of reciprocity. After engaging in a sexual relationship, they expected a gift. And so you can imagine that the Europeans saw this as prostitution, and the women didn't see it this way. Gift giving was a huge part of Native culture. It was practiced before every ceremony, it was practiced within every holy day, and so for these women it would have simply been a cultural norm. And yet Europeans certainly would have viewed this with a good bit of disdain for Native women. Even once women were married, oftentimes if they lived in a matrilineal tribe, they could continue to have sex with men who weren't their husbands. And so one Native woman wrote, "You French love only your own children, but we love all the children of our tribe." And part of this could have been the fact that a woman in some of these tribes wasn't always 100% sure who the father of her child actually was. A great example of the differing norms when it comes to marriage and sexuality of Indigenous people would be that of hunting women. And these were women in the Great Lakes region who did not necessarily marry, but did form temporary unions with male hunting companions. And sometimes these hunting companions in the colonial era would actually be French companions. And they would travel through the forest with the men, and their relationship would last only as long as the hunt did. And the women wouldn't hunt, but they would take care of their companion, and they would ensure that they were well fed and that their laundry was done and that they had clothing to wear, and they expected compensation in return, monetary compensation. Both parties enjoyed sex during this short-term relationship, but if a woman became pregnant, then she could go ahead and give birth to the child and send that child back to her home village, and it was not treated as anything that was shameful. Another good example of this are Two-Spirit people. And a Two-Spirit is a Native man who would dress and take on the gender roles of a woman. And so living as a woman would also usually include marrying a man. And the term berdache is what the French explorers labeled these people. It means sodomite, which probably gives you a window just based on this derogatory naming of how the French viewed them. Yet in Native society, these were very powerful individuals. They were seen to have spiritual power. They were often tribal leaders and counselors, especially marriage counselors. And some were also shamans. And the reason they were viewed as being so powerful is the fact that they could transcend the boundaries of gender, and so they were believed to be close to the spirit world. In some of these tribes, men were in fact not allowed to refuse any kind of sexual demands from other young men. And there have been a lot of questions by anthropologists and historians about whether Native Americans who were Two-Spirits chose to be Two-Spirits actively, or whether their parents pushed them into this by force. Because certainly if you came from a less well-known or less wealthy family, this was a way for your family to climb the ranks of the social hierarchy. But regardless of this, what Two-Spirit people represent is the fluidity of gender roles and sexuality in Native cultures, and that kind of fluidity does not exist in European cultures. So the second group of people that I want you all to have a basic understanding of are African societies before the transatlantic slave trade really picked up, and before it began to decimate and change the population of Africa. And I know that a lot of students don't have a great deal of historical training in African history, but when I talk about Africa and the people of Africa, sometimes I'll reference different regions, and much like Native American cultures, you can't say that there's one monolithic culture, but within each of these regions there's very similar cultures, because culture is of course influenced by your geography, and your subsistence methods are based around what is available, as well as your religious views are based around your subsistence methods. So certainly there are similarities between groups living within one of these subgroups, and those include Northern Africa, which would include places like Egypt, Eastern Africa, which you might have learned about in world history when you studied Ethiopia and the ancient kingdoms of Meroe and Aksum. Central and Southern Africa, which are the location of the Bantu migration or the language movement out of Central Africa and down into the Kalahari Desert. And then lastly, Western Africa, which is actually a really important area located around the Niger River Basin. There are cities like Timbuktu and Janae, which became very important centers of learning after the Crusades, and a center of a very strong gunpowder empire called the Songhai Empire, as well as this is where you see some of the strongest trade networks leading from Western Africa over into Northern and Eastern Africa. In many ways, the stereotypes that have followed Africans as well as African Americans are very similar to those of Native Americans, and they emerged very generally from the colonial era and continued on up into the present day through the form of mass media. Especially today, television is the biggest outlet when it comes to the dissemination of stereotypes. And once again, there are two main stereotypes that fall on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. The first is the primitive savage stereotype that holds that Europeans brought Africans over from a barbaric tribal group, and that these groups killed one another off and practiced evil voodoo magic, and the justification for doing so is that it's okay to enslave them because they're not Christian and because Europeans don't believe they're human anyways. The other kind of stereotype of Africa and of the original Africans coming over into the Americas is that of the innocent noble savage, and this stereotype holds that Africans are unfairly being stolen from their pristine, beautiful country, and they're taken to the debauched shores of North America, and this once peaceful group of people are subjected to the violent whims of all Europeans. And so, on the one hand, you have Africans and later African Americans being portrayed as barbaric, uncivilized, uneducated, practicing voodoo and magic, and then on the other hand, you have them portrayed as innocent, childlike, almost stupid, and almost all Europeans and Anglo-Americans as evil and violent. And so once again, neither of these stereotypes really captures the truth of what happens in history, and we'll have to kind of flesh out a more full picture over the course of the semester. So if we were to compare the subsistence methods of Africans to that of Native Americans, you would find a great deal more diversity in Africa, and this is because if you look at each of those different cultural subgroups I discussed earlier, each one of them has a much different climate and a much different kind of soil condition, and so there are going to be different subsistence methods that arise. For the most part, agriculture was rather difficult in Africa because it was a tropical location, but in places like the Northeast, you would find plow-based farming. Women would in fact have been the farmers, and men have been the hunters, and so this is very much like Native American society. And it's really going to throw Europeans off when they start the transatlantic slave trade and think that because European men were the farmers, that the people they need to transport to the Americas are going to be the African men. And in fact, they'll do this, and the African men won't necessarily know as much about planting as the women do, because that wasn't the role they had in their gender-based division of labor. Now, you also see in the Northeast that there's a great deal of long-distance trade with Egypt and also the Mediterranean, so it's a fairly prosperous and cosmopolitan area. When you compare that to the western part of Africa, the Niger River Valley, they rely much more on ironworking as well as on villages of various artisans. And then lastly, in Southeast Africa, they rely more on animal husbandry, as well as on hunting and gathering. And so the traditions and the beliefs of the people in each of these different areas is going to be based upon how it is that they survive. And so they'll be very different depending on where you live. There is a great deal more unity in the political systems of Africa, though, when compared to Native Americans. Early on, a lot of the locations in Africa actually followed an all-powerful female monarch, and she was so powerful that when she died, she would be put into a grave, and many of her most powerful male subjects would be buried alive with her. But by the time we move into the 1500s, which is the 16th century, Islam has begun to make its way down into Africa as a result of the Crusades and the birth of the gunpowder empires that are led by Muslims. And along with this is a much more patriarchal tradition. Patriarchy is often associated with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, with the Abrahamic religions. And so you'll start to see a much more male-dominated political system, but the position of the Queen Mother is also going to stay extremely important. And this Queen Mother can actually intercede for those who offend the king, and her influence can actually lead to the removal of the king, which is a little bit like in some of the societies in native culture in which the matrons who chose the chief could also dethrone the chief. Unlike in Native American societies, the social structure of Africa was never really divided. First, most Africans early on were matriarchal. Women in a lot of parts of Africa, even today, in places that are traditionally assumed to be patriarchal, are still afforded a great deal of respect and power. And then following the Crusades, which happened between the 11th century and the 13th century, Islam begins to spread throughout Europe and the Middle East and Africa, especially in the form of the Ottoman Empire, for example. And as these Islamic traditions move into the African world, they began to bring patriarchy with them, but not in the same way as you see it in the Middle East, for example. So Muslim women in Africa didn't wear veils, and they maintained friendships with men who were not members of their immediate family. So you do see a transition from matrilineal to patrilineal societies, but women remain respected, and there isn't necessarily such a harsh system of patriarchy as what could have emerged. There are a couple different stages of religious beliefs in Africa, and the first stage is that there were lots of different beliefs in polytheism, ancestor worship, the ability of shamans to transcend into the spirit world, a belief in magic and rituals and witch doctors, and in fact there are still plenty of tribal groups that believe in these religious systems. But the second stage of religion that entered Africa is called Coptic Christianity, and this is a form of Christianity that came by way of Egypt. It is the official name for the largest Christian church in Egypt, as well as in the Middle East, and it was actually founded by King Ezana in the 4th century. This is located right around the stronghold of Ethiopia. In the Middle Ages, it's going to become incredibly Christianized, and there will be a great deal of missionaries going to that area, but the third stage of religion sort of slows down the process of Christianity when Islam begins moving into Africa. And in a lot of ways, if you look at Africa today, you can see it as a battleground for faith. In places like Ethiopia, you certainly find Christians, but you also find large Muslim populations, especially in Western Africa. And then down in South Africa, with the Bantu-speaking people, you see a great deal of belief in polytheism and magic and rituals, and even witch doctors continuing to practice. When we discuss slavery in Native American culture, we talked about how slavery was not necessarily fundamental to their social system, and it was mostly just because of the fact that they captured prisoners of war. But this isn't true for African society. Africa was very strongly influenced by the Roman and Greek institution of slavery because there was so much contact between Eastern and Northern Africa and the Mediterranean world. And so slavery was a part of their economic structure for many centuries before the transatlantic slave trade ever came. And there was a sort of hierarchy of types of slaves that existed. So, for example, you had captured slaves versus born slaves. People who were captured in warfare were not necessarily as high in prestige as those people who were born into slavery within the communities. There was also a system of pawnship, and pawnship is when people would actually pawn a child, for example, or a family member in order to pay for a debt. We still have pawnship today, and it's especially true of little girls and little children in Africa and in China and some other Asian countries, where a family they'll be riddled with debt, and they'll be forced to pawn their child into a system of sexual slavery. And usually in Africa, these children were girls, and they were held by a creditor until the family could pay the debt. And typically a pawn would be treated a little bit better than a slave because their family was located nearby and would be upset if they saw their family member being mistreated. But much like the Europeans when they arrive in the New World, there has been a long history of relying upon slaves and upon others to help with their labor that doesn't necessarily exist in the native world. There are, however, a great deal of similarities between Native Americans and Africans when we consider their marriage customs, their family life, and their sexual norms. Even after the introduction of patriarchy and Islam, women in Africa still obtain some very important forms of control over their lives. And this can be seen in the fact that in some societies it was very easy for women to get a divorce and to still maintain their position of high status. And that while wealthy men could practice polygamy, each wife had to have their own hut on their husband's compound, and they were allowed to keep their children with them until they were grown. So just like in Native American culture, if you were going to be practicing polygamy, you had to be wealthy enough to really take good care of each one of your wives and your children. There was also a form of polygamy that existed in Africa later on that's very interesting, in which African women would take other wives is a form of polygamy. And this happened because eventually the male population of Africa would be so depleted by the transatlantic slave trade that family formation would essentially be torn apart. In African society, marriage was seen as a way of organizing labor because land was shared communally and its use was determined mostly by elders. And so a man's claim to the labor of his wife and his children was a very important and in many ways a scarce commodity. And so a man in Africa would be required to pay what's known as a bride price for his wife. And this is because women were recognized as important workers, and it significantly increased their husband's wealth when he married them. And so he would pay this bride price in the form of cattle or cash or valuables. And if he didn't do so, then it would mean that this was not a legitimate marriage. He had no claim to the children and no claim to the labor of the woman. Women in African society were twice as likely as men to be slaves, and this is because they were prized for both their productive and their reproductive labor. So women would have been the ones who understood how to farm as well as animal husbandry, and also they would have been valued for the fact that they could reproduce and have children, which could then become slaves as well. Some women were purchased by men in order to become concubines, and it was because it was simply cheaper to have a concubine than a wife. You didn't necessarily have to meet all of the standards of upkeep when it came to a concubine in the way you did for a wife. And these unions were considered inferior by the community, but they certainly were not uncommon. If a woman was a slave and she was taken and not taken by a master as a concubine, then sometimes he would give her as a gift to another member member of the family. And if they bore a child with their master or with any other free man in the master's household, they and their children could then eventually be set free. So by the time we get into the 15th century, all of these different societies are going to clash together in a very powerful way. The Europeans are going to discover the New World and begin to colonize and take over Native American land. They will also begin to engage in the transatlantic slave trade, and while only about 500,000 slaves will come to the Americas and many more will actually go to other areas such as Brazil and the Caribbean, there will still be a slave society in the South based upon this transatlantic slave trade. And what we're going to do is spend nearly the rest of the semester looking at how this plays out for the various groups of Americans, the African Americans, the Native Americans, the Anglo-Americans, and we'll see very soon that the indigenous population is going to fall drastically in the Great Dying as a result of disease and warfare. That Europeans who are looking for a profit are going to go out and believe they are conquering inferior people, and that bringing African labor over to the New World is the only way to set up a successful society. And really central to the argument of Europeans is the idea that the kind of gender relationships, the division of labor, and the sexual norms of Africans and Native Americans are different and also degraded. And also the idea that the religious beliefs of Africans and Native Americans are just plain wrong, and that their political systems are weak. And what this represents is something called ethnocentrism, and it's something you want to really avoid. If you look at other cultures and you can only see them through the lens of your own, that is being ethnocentric. You want to establish cultural relativism where you can acknowledge that there is a culture that does something differently. It may not be the way you would do it. It may not be the way that you believe or even something that you believe is good, but that there is an inherent value in understanding the belief of these people and that they don't always necessarily need to be changed. And there are going to be times over the course of the semester where you'll be introduced to some challenging material. It may challenge your belief system or your view of the world, but keep in mind too that this is part of what college is about. It's about expanding your horizons and attempting to gain a better understanding of a diverse group of people, and that's exactly what we're going to aim to do throughout the course of the semester.